I would like to call to order today's meeting, the Executive Branch Audit Committee. Could I ask clerk to take the roll, please? Lieutenant Governor Marshall. Secretary of State Zagaski.
Here.
Treasurer Konine. Here. Controller Byrne.
Here.
Attorney General Ford.
Here.
Ms. DeLong.
Here.
Chair Governor Sisolak. Here. We have a, thank you. I didn't know you were doing the function there. Thank you. Let's see here. I've got some remarks, but I'm going to use them when I get to those various audits. So I'll hold off on that. The first item is number 2 is public comment. Anyone wishing to address the board on any items that are on today's agenda, please step forward, identify yourself for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes. I'll start in Carson City.
Yes. Hi, my name is Sandy Anderson. I'm the Executive Director for the Nevada State Board of Massage Therapy. Governor, members of the committee. I just would like to make a public comment regarding how much the Governor's Office of Finance Audit Division has worked with us, how Internal Controls has worked with us to help our agency turn ourselves around and become more in compliance. And I'd like to ask you, as you're looking at what to do with boards and commissions, the area where we had the most embezzlement by my predecessor was in payroll. And if you could convert everybody that works for a board or commission to central payroll, that would be extremely helpful as far as embezzlements are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else in Carson City? I can't see the audience, so is that a no?
That's a no, Governor.
Thank you. Anyone in Las Vegas wishing to speak during public comment? Seeing and hearing no one. I'm going to close the public comment section. Item number 3, approval of the November 7th, 2019 minutes. Do we have a motion? Aye?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Item number 4. Presentation of audit 6-month follow-up status reports pursuant to NRS 353A.090. First one, Nevada's Independent Occupational and Professional Licensing Boards.
Thank you, Governor. We made 2 recommendations that are partially implemented. We've listed the status for you. I believe that Director Reynolds is in Carson City and would like to make a few comments about the progress of that audit.
Okay.
Excuse me, get the mic turned on.
That's good.
Thank you very much, Governor Sisolak and members of the Executive Audit Committee. Wanted to go over a couple things. As you know, we've been working with the Governor's internal audit team. As they've reviewed all the state's boards and commissions, especially those boards and commissions that handle occupational licensing. Department of Business and Industry, over the past directors and the current director, have spent several hours with the audit team going over the structure and operation of these boards. We've discussed various options from the framework of the boards and how they are incorporated into the agencies versus a standalone board or an executive director and separate staff. We have looked at several states' occupational and professional licensing structures. We probably looked at about 23 different states in terms of what they do. 2 of the western states have really have stood out, and we've also been looking now because Alaska is basically going through some of the same things that we are, and with their occupational licensing. The 2 states that have the function of occupational licensing as a division under the Department of Commerce of Business and Regulation are Colorado and Utah. Their occupational licensing structure is very similar to the structure and administration and support within the Department of Business and Industry for their licensing functions and for how they administer those boards. The divisions in each one of these states provide for, and I listed out several things, but I'll go through them rather quickly, central administration. The department, through an organization that centralizes administration and division with bureaus that provide fiscal and administrative support and oversight. There is an overall budget for the division which incorporates administration, legal, as well as licensure functions for each one of the occupational areas. Complaint investigations and compliance investigation. The investigation and compliance functions are consolidated into a single unit with a chief of investigations and compliance investigation teams. Standard investigation procedures are followed in preparation for hearings on licensing and discipline. They work in concert with the Attorney General's office, who provides legal support to these investigative teams. Internal controls. There are standard internal fiscal controls similar to what we have within our state and for our state agencies. Legal representation. Support is provided through the Attorney General's office with the Deputy AG assigned to their bureau, which would oversee several occupational licensing boards. The Deputy AG worked with the policy boards and staff on licensing, regulatory issues, and to provide hearing support. Policy boards. The boards are made up of subject experts in various occupational fields, as well as private citizens. So there are not only subject experts from the policy boards, but there are also private citizens that sit within those boards. Policy matters are left to the purview of the occupational boards that work closely with the division and their respective bureau chiefs. Transparency and consumer protection. Each state has a website that provides for consumer information regarding regulations and regulatory changes, disciplinary actions, and how to file a complaint. It's very easy to find board minutes, discipline, and regulatory actions for each one of the occupational boards. The websites also promote occupational career information. These occupational licensing structure is very similar to the structure, administration support, as I indicated for the Department of Business and Industry for our licensing functions. And I think I mentioned this before, but we oversee and issue about 265,000 licenses within the Department of Business and Industry. We believe that central administration and consistency of regulation for occupations and professional licensing in Nevada is really a step in the right direction, and we support that effort. We also have been looking at the IT structures that they have within these different states, which are very similar in nature to the portal that's supplied for by the Secretary of State, where you can go in and do license renewal online. You can fill out applications for your license, and it takes significantly less time to be able to do that. But there's also information on how to get a license, the value of having that license, promoting the fact of getting a license within the state for each occupation. So it's not only just to sign up and get your license, but it also promotes getting a license and tells you the benefit of what it is to have a license. So I have a copy of this testimony. I provided information also on kind of a fact sheet for what Utah does and also what Colorado does. And I'm happy to leave that with you. For your members that are down in Las Vegas, I'll send that in PDF form to you so you'll have a copy of that. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry, appreciate it. Do we have any questions from Las Vegas here first?
Just a comment. I know that there have been
General
some
Ford.
questions raised regarding training for open meeting law issues and things of that sort. I just wanted to highlight the fact that my office, since the last meeting, has posted online videos for OML training, and that our Chief Board Love has testified in front of the Sunset Committee on training and assistance at my office.
Any questions in Carson City on 4A?
No, Governor, thank you.
Okay, this is information only, so we'll go on to 4B.
Thank you, Governor. This is our 6-month follow-up of the recommendations. 3 have been partially implemented. I would highlight the 2 which we have determined have no action. The first is recommendation 2 to follow statute for third-party liability. We believe that the statute is rather clear. The board to review claims has put out a guidance that the division could in fact use those third-party liability funds. We've talked, we've disagreed, and we've agreed to disagree, and we are going to ask for an official opinion from the Attorney General's office on the use of those funds. That there's a draft letter out for your signature in the near term, and then we will get it over to the Attorney General's office. The second recommendation where we've determined it's no action is on revising enrollment and reimbursement policies. While the division believes that what they have in place is sufficient, we believe that the facts as they documented and we were able to follow up on showed that there could be some tightening up in those procedures. We intend to revisit this recommendation during the annual follow-up and hope that during that time there can be some movement towards a better process that would ensure this sort of action doesn't happen again.
Great, thank you. I just have two brief comments, and I think they echo what Warren has said. We need a policy moving forward that is clear, so everybody understands what it is, and I think the letter coming through the AG's office is going to help considerably for members to understand that. And then the transparency has to be there at the same time, because there was some opaqueness, let's just say, with some of what was happening here, and I don't think that serves anyone well. So I think we need to make sure that everyone is clear on what the policy is as we move forward, and hopefully that letter will bring some clarity. Any other questions? Secretary Sagaski.
Thank you, Governor. One of the things I'd just like to bring up for recommendation 3 in 4B is I just wondered what the timeline for the new resolution and implementation of the guidelines and site audits was, and when do they expect to be adopted by the board?
Thank you, Secretary Sagaski. Greg Lovato, Administrator of NDEP, for the record. We do have a proposed field audit policy that will be before the Petroleum Fund Board this coming next meeting at its March 12th quarterly meeting, and we will be implementing it thereafter.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Governor.
Certainly.
Quick question.
General Ford.
Attorney General Ford, Greg Lovato for the record. We are scheduled to propose a new definition for small business that we may recommend in a bill draft request. We're going to bring that before the board also at the March 12th meeting. And per their recommendation or approval, the agency will propose that for a revision in the NRS.
Thank you.
Anything? Any question? No further questions down south. Any questions up north?
No, Governor, thank you.
Okay. That is also an information-only item 4B. Item number 5, presentation of audit reports pursuant to NRS 353A.085, Nevada Board of Pharmacy. We're all familiar with this one. We probably are all familiar with this one. I have some comments I'd like to read before the presentation, and then I've got some questions. So I'll begin with this. As many of you know, I have not been shy about sharing my serious concern over the issue that we're about to hear regarding the Board of Pharmacy. As a refresher, on May 3rd, 2019, DPS Director Tagliati informed my office of his agency's discovery that the Nevada State Board of Pharmacy had routinely failed, as far back as 2007, to submit fingerprints for criminal background checks as required by law. On that same day, I issued a letter to then chair of the board imposing an immediate moratorium on issuing of any new pharmacy licenses. I also directed the Division of Investigations to look into the board's fingerprint and background check practices. Based on NDI's findings and to supplement their initial conclusions, I also requested that the Executive Branch Audit Division conduct an emergency audit of the pharmacy board with a specific focus on wholesale pharmacy licensing requirements, fingerprint background checks, and fee collections. The findings of this audit report of the Board of Pharmacy's licensing process are deeply concerning. Two aspects of this report concern me: the breadth of the problem and how long it has persisted for. It is unconscionable that this board and staff simply ignored their statutory obligation to conduct background checks to ensure that professionals in this space were properly vetted. It's beyond the pale that this board collected money from Nevadans to perform a service that was never actually being done. And it is entirely unacceptable that they ignored the most basic bookkeeping and accounting practices by commingling fingerprint fees with other board funds. Equally troubling is the fact that concerns over these practices were raised well over a decade ago. There was more than ample time to address and resolve the issues raised in this report over a number of years, but that didn't happen. I have no control over the past decade of inaction, but the safety and well-being of Nevadans now falls squarely on me, and it's my administration's duty to tackle this issue head-on. The findings and recommendations of this audit report are the blueprint of how the board will restore public faith in this process, but meaningful reform of this board must also come with accountability. I expect that those who knew of this problem and sat idly by will be held accountable. Last fall, I made 4 new appointments to this board, and I am confident that the board, including these new appointees, fully appreciate the gravity of these findings and have begun to take necessary action to restore public and industry trust that has been lost. I have every expectation that they will continue to aggressively implement the recommendations laid out in this report. With that, I'd ask you to begin your presentation.
Good afternoon, Governor and committee members. For the record, Sharon G. Baines, Executive Branch Auditor. Here to represent the Board of Pharmacy is Executive Director David Wiest. At the request of the Executive Branch Audit Committee, we performed an audit on the Board of Pharmacy. We concluded that the board was in compliance with background check procedures. However, additional improvements to the licensing process are needed to bring the board in alignment with practices used by other Nevada boards. Since the moratorium on wholesale licenses was imposed in May, the board has screened over 1,100 existing licenses and conducted 317 fingerprint background checks on 106 non-exempt licensees. Additionally, the board has established a process to review and track applications along with fingerprint requests and results. Board agendas have been modified to segregate applicants with potentially disqualifying events for heightened board review. Our audit focused on 2 objectives: improving the wholesale background check process and improving the overall licensing process. To improve the wholesale background check process, we made 3 recommendations. Establish management oversight of the background check cycle, enforce fingerprint authority more stringently, and modify fingerprint protocols for wholesale license renewals. Establishing management oversight of the background check cycle will allow management to maintain control of the entire process and identify process bottlenecks by developing full cycle tracking logs, establishing periodic review of the tracking log, and developing criteria under which an application may be rejected when fingerprint cards have been rejected twice. Our recommendation to enforce fingerprint authority more stringently will help to thoroughly vet persons on each application for potential fingerprinting, consistent with the board's statutory authority by identifying persons with significant influence over the operation and requiring an official list of officers from the Home Business Registration Agency to verify the accuracy of officers listed on an application. The board should modify fingerprint protocols for wholesale license renewals by using the statutorily required annual updated list of stakeholders to identify new persons of influence rather than fingerprinting all renewal applicants. This will reduce the workload for board staff, ensure more thorough vetting of applicant stakeholders, and align more closely to other boards that only require fingerprints for initial licensure and not renewals. Regarding our second objective to improve the overall licensing process, we made 2 recommendations. First, require fingerprint background checks for other license types such as pharmacists and pharmacy technicians. Currently, only wholesalers are required to submit fingerprint amongst the board's 17 different license types. Other states that we surveyed require fingerprint background checks for pharmacy and prescribing individuals. Similarly, other Nevada boards that regulate healthcare professionals have a widespread approach to fingerprinting prior to licensing. Finally, account for fingerprint fees separately. The board has been collecting fees since 2006. The amount of fees collected for fingerprint processing could not be determined through financial records. Rather, the board's case management system was used to make this determination. Fees have now been returned with interest. We would like to thank the board for the time and input throughout this audit. We'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee may have at this time.
Okay. Does that complete your report, your presentation?
Yes, it does, Governor.
Okay, I've got, and I know there's going to be a bunch of questions. I've got one question for the auditors and then a plethora of questions for the board and their representatives. How does the board catch folks convicted of disqualifying crimes in between the licensing renewals? For example, if you get licensed today and you commit a crime tomorrow, we're relying on self-reporting. Is there any way for the board to capture that information?
Governor, for the record, Jeff Landerfeld, Executive Branch Manager. Governor, there's a provision in statute that requires an annual update of stakeholders, an annual update from wholesale licensees of stakeholders. And that report is to identify anyone new to their operation or influence on their operation, and to and to also disclose any new disqualifying events. Now, that's an annual update. There's also a provision in that same statute, 639-505, that requires any interim change within that annual update period to do likewise. As well as there's a provision that prohibits the wholesaler of using anyone in their operation in any capacity that would be deemed significant influence if they are required to submit a fingerprint or report their criminal history because of new disqualifying events.
Is there any way we verify that, or is it all just self-reporting?
That is self-reported, and
okay.
That's why we've recommended that annual update process be used to more carefully.
Submitted fingerprints and waivers. What happened to the 106?
Governor, we would refer that to the board.
The board? Okay. Then that'll be my first question for the board.
Thank you, sir. Dave Weiss for the record, and I'd like to thank you for your assistance through this process, particularly DPS's assistance through the process, the auditors and your budget division. They were invaluable in us being able to fix it, and I'm glad today that they can say that we are following the law. We have 1,100 licensees in this category. We were down to the 106 that required by law that had to do the fingerprint background checks. That's as an entity that may have one or more persons that needed to have the checks. When we ran those fingerprints, which we have 24 licensees that had what we call disqualifying events, which is a DPS term. It doesn't mean that they couldn't be part of the wholesaler. It just means they're disqualified from being part of the wholesaler without direct approval from the board themselves. And so those 24 people are in the process of going in front of the board, choosing to disclose that event or not disclose that event. The board will take the appropriate action on that. We've done 6 already. We have 9 that have been noticed for the March 18th meeting, and then the other 9 will be noticed for the April meeting. So we're down to 24 people that had disqualifying events, although I want to be clear that that doesn't disqualify them. It just means that they have to be addressed by the board. The new applications that have come in since the moratorium that you put on May 3rd, they all just follow what is the current process. So they just, if they have a disqualifying event, they go in front of the board.
Okay. The report recommends that the board ends the practice of collecting fingerprints at every renewal and instead just collect them when you do your initial application, the initial phase. My understanding is other boards do the same thing, operate in this manner, but question to that, do those boards do a full background check at each renewal?
I don't know that for sure. The auditors did that. We've certainly talked to the other boards. I will put on the record that we've certainly looked at how the gaming board does things. So one of the regs that we're going to do is directly taken from the gaming board. I don't know that answer, but maybe the auditors would be able to answer that.
Governor, for the record, Jeff Landerfeld, Executive Branch Audit Manager. My understanding is that the boards at initial licensure conduct the same fingerprint background check as the Board of Pharmacy currently does at both initial licensure and renewal. So that is a full background check.
Okay, can DPS do a full background check at renewal without fingerprints?
Dave Weiss for the record. There's an option to do a name check, so I think that we could do a name check, but I think the proper way would probably be to get the fingerprints and do that if that's what the law requires.
On the renewals, are we just relying totally on self-reporting here of these events, is what I'm understanding?
So, as it sits now, we intend to do the annual updated list of employees during our renewal period and then our off renewal period, so we'll do that yearly. And they are required to notify us within 30 days. And then Section 3 of NRS 639-505 also requires them to not have anybody that has influence that would meet that criteria. I think again, I thank you for the help to where we got today, but I don't think we're at the finish line. We still need to do some regs. We may need to do a statute. So I think we could certainly address that concern as we move forward, because I share your concern with it.
Okay, on the self-reporting, do we audit on a random basis, or?
So on the self-reporting, we actually do go look at it, but if you look at the recommendation that they put, I think there's a better document to use than what we use, which is the Secretary of State at the domicile state where they are, that we could match up that, and I fully believe that's the right recommendation. We didn't have that before the auditors came because we were matching up to what they said, and we were matching up to potentially what other boards at that board had, but I think the Secretary of State is the proper, so that is definitely in our procedures moving forward, that we will go to the Secretary of State ourselves and match that list up. So I share your concern that you have.
Okay, on page 6 of the report, it indicates that if a background check comes back with no disqualifying events, the report is not retained. It's not kept. Can you walk me through that process?
Yes, sir. Dave Weiss for the record. In doing that, we adopted exactly what the repository said was the standard of doing this. So we follow their retention records, and we follow whether we do a civil name check or not. If we get 2 fingerprints and they just can't be read by the FBI or the state repository, their procedures are to do a civil name check. So as we go through that process, depending on what happens with it, if there's no disqualifying event, and I gotta say again, that doesn't mean that they can't have a license, it just means that's the term that we use in our policies, then it doesn't need to be retained, but we retain them exactly to the standard of the repository. Okay.
Is it a single individual that reviews these, or is there a double check?
That's a good question. The fingerprints, Dave Weiss for the record, the fingerprints come in and they just get processed. So there's not an opportunity for somebody there shouldn't be an opportunity for somebody to remove them. So they come in the mail and they go right to the repository. The repository handles doing the background check, and then the results come back, and again, it's CRY or protected information, so we have a safe that we keep it in, and it's got to go in that safe. There are multiple people reviewing what the criminal background check reveals and per policy, and ultimately it's the board's decision on what happens with that. Staff does not have the ability to say this crime is something we're not worried about, or this is not. It's totally up to the board in an open meeting to make that decision on the licensee.
But my concern is that wasn't happening before.
The auditors helped us fix that problem, and moving forward, it is not a problem. And again, sorry, sir, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
We're dealing with 2 categories. We're dealing with the people that have been licensed, and we have to go back, and we've checked every one of these, and they've pulled hundreds of our applicants to make sure that we've done that right. And then moving forward, that's not the issue, because the issue, we have the policy. So moving forward, there's no concern. We're still in this making sure that the public is safe with the current licensees.
Okay, and I'm a little concerned that the existing statute only contemplates background checks on persons of influence, quote unquote, at the wholesaler level. Not everyone who handles the drugs, for example, pharmacists or pharmacist techs, are screened. Do you enforce any requirement that the wholesalers submit updated annual lists of
vendor. We're doing it manually now, but the goal is to get it in a software vendor, making sure that we notify these people that they do. And then if they don't do it, that would be a required appearance with the board to explain why they didn't do it. So
you started it in October? Is that what I understand?
it's coming this October. Again, the auditors were invaluable in laying out this procedure for what we want to do. We had many discussions about what exactly needed to happen. There was certainly some misunderstanding on that. We've worked through all those issues. I clearly know how to follow the law and will be following the law.
So it's not going to start for another 7 months?
Well, the issue is that we need some regulatory change on potential regulatory change to make sure we're identifying who the people that are doing influence. And again, I'll refer back to we've taken a very hard look at the gaming board to utilize their language for who's influencing casinos. So if we can do something before that time, we will. But we need some help from our board to provide some regulatory direction on exactly who is doing it. The people that are located in the state, sir, we can go identify who's influencing what, but we license all the out-of-state, which I think is the right way to handle it, and we need to make a little bit more robust procedure there, but the regulatory process is the way to do it. And back to your first point, the pharmacists and all the other people, staff is totally in agreement that should be looked at. That would be a statutory change. So I do not have the capability of requiring that without the statute, is my understanding.
Okay, well, I'm confident and hopeful at least that the board will address this prior to 7 months from now, that they can come up with a plan.
Yes, sir.
What is the process that's used to communicate with wholesalers, the informal process?
We're required, we do it by mail, and there's some requirement that it's certified mail and some other non-certified mail. So we've corresponded with them many times through this process, and we currently use the mail. And of course, we talk to them if they call in.
Is there a process, a formal process to record any changes that they might make?
There is a process for that. It's manual right now. The hope would be that we would get it automated through our software platform.
So it's a software problem that's preventing you from doing it?
No, we're doing it. It's not a problem. It's just that when you're talking with a handful, which we're dealing with right now, it's manageable. When you're talking about 1,100 potential license categories, we'll have to say these people qualify for, we're going to look at everybody regardless whether they need fingerprints. So we're going to need a software. We're in the process of building that so that it can be manual and that the computer can kick out. These are people that we need to look at, sir.
Okay, so what other resources do you need that you don't have to implement these?
You've given us every resource. I mean, you have identified the problem, helped us fix the problem, and the auditors, I look forward to the auditors coming back and we troubleshoot any issues we have in the time frame. So I think that's the process.
Okay. Page 12 indicates there were 2 licensees who did not comply with the board's request for new fingerprints.
Yes.
What happened to those 2 wholesalers?
So one, Dave Weiss for the record, the license has been revoked from the board, so that's gone through the whole hearing process. So anybody that wasn't giving us fingerprints when they needed to went in front of the board. So their license has been revoked. And the second one, they've currently tested that they're no longer wholesaling, and they've requested some time from the board to be able to see if they formulate how they structure their company is the way that they actually.
Well, how much time did you give them to come into compliance?
We have a meeting every 6 weeks, so they have to the next meeting to come in compliance with it. So that happened at our last meeting, and then they'll be in front of us at our next meeting.
And there'll be no more extensions then?
Candidly, that's up to the board because I don't get that decision, but I will take those exact words back to them. So yes, I hear what you're saying, sir.
Okay, now I want to ask you about fingerprint fees.
Sure.
We were all very concerned with the commingling of the fees with other funds. And it's my understanding, and I want to give credit where credit's due, you now have 2 separate accounts that these are all kept separate, correct?
Absolutely, sir, and we did identify all the fees that we needed to give back. It wasn't by the means that would be typical, because we didn't have that, but we spent many hours working through identifying those, and to date, they have been returned with interest, and moving forward, they are separate, and there's a whole cascade of procedures to make sure they stay separate, sir.
Okay. And you've accepted the vast majority of these findings and agreed to make adjustments within 6 months, is my understanding.
100% we accept, we agree with them. We were part of the process when they did it, and it was a good process. The one that's outstanding is we have a couple things to be clear. If we do a regulation, that's got to go through the regulatory process. It's at our March meeting that we're going to be addressing all the regulations that we said that we would address. So the board will make that decision, and then it goes through the regulatory process. So we will begin it it'll begin in March. The statutory one's the only one that's problematic because, as you know, that one is not one that we can fix at this time. But we accept that recommendation.
Okay, and I understand that 6 months is allowed by law, but you don't have to take 6 months.
No, sorry.
No, that's...
We're not going to take 6 months. The beginning of the fix will start March. It's already started, but for the public, they'll see it in March, and then that'll go to LCB, and then it gets codified, then it has to come back to another public hearing as required by law, and then it goes to the Legislative Commission on Regulation, and they have to approve it. I don't have control over that whole process, but it's my job to walk these through the process and make sure everybody understands why they're so important, and I will do that.
Okay. And last October, on October 29th, and I know the date because it's my daughter's birthday, I delivered remarks concerning the board and called for the board to hold those accountable who failed to meet their statutory duty to protect the health and safety of Nevadans. This recommendation was based on Audit Division findings. Can you tell me what actions the board has taken in response to my comments?
Yeah, I think Dave Weiss for the record, they obviously took your comments very seriously, and I did too. So we identified, early in this process, we identified anybody that had a role in it, and they were removed from the role. I joined the board in January 1st of 2019, around the time you were in office, and so we've identified that. We have had turnover in the board since the time. We've lost a person that was involved in it, and then I've taken responsibility to carry it forward, and the board's holding me, and they've done it in the board member. They've restructured, and it's in the audit. They've restructured beyond what happens with the fingerprints, but just how the board operates in their meetings to clearly identify what's happening with these license types.
Okay, so when did you begin your tenure, your positions with this board? The first time?
January 1st of 2019, sir.
You had no interaction with them before that, no positions?
I was a staff member at the board prior to that. I took ownership of the board on January 1st.
Okay, go back to your staff member. When did that begin?
January of 2013.
Okay, and what positions have you held in the interim?
Inspector and deputy of the board.
Okay, and what authority do you have?
I have the authority that's provided by the legislature to do what they say for the secretary at this point.
Okay, well, let me ask it this way here.
Yes, sir.
Do I have, as governor, do I have any authority to discipline the individuals that were lax in their oversight?
I would assume that you do, sir.
Governor, for the record, Warren Lohman, you do not have that authority. That authority rests with the Board of Pharmacy.
See, this is my issue. I don't have any authority to discipline or to change any of these people that are there.
Yes, sir. There's anybody that had anything to directly do with the fingerprints prior to May 3rd is no longer on this, is dealing with fingerprints. It's a completely new staff that's on the fingerprints, and I think rightfully so. And if you wanted to tell me to do something, I would do it, sir. So I did not know you didn't have the ability to discipline me, but I would assume you do.
Okay, they're not on fingerprints. Does that mean you changed their functions? Or what does that mean? Have they been terminated? Have they been reprimanded? Have they been disciplined? What's happened?
There's been there was.
Could just real quickly, Mr. Governor.
Yeah, I don't go to personnel matters. Is that where I'm going here?
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know how far you intend to get into it, but my suggestion would be that to the extent you get more specific than the general questions, that we not have that in open meeting.
Okay, well then let me ask you,
I welcome the opportunity to talk to you after this meeting about those issues. I want you to understand those issues.
okay, well, my understanding is that I don't have the authority when I call for changes at some of this. Who specifically has that authority?
Governor, if I may, for the record, Warren Lohman, based on statute, that rests with the Board of Pharmacy itself.
Board itself, okay. I'll stop at that. I've got more, but I want to give some other folks a chance. Who else? Secretary Sagaski.
I just want to clarify something that was said. And I think if you look back at any of the information that we have on page 11 of 27, it suggests that the applicant, we need to make sure that everybody understands this. We do not verify the validity of the list on file with our office. That was never given to us. That authority was not given to us by the legislature. And these lists may not include those that have ownership interest or can otherwise exert significant influence over the entity. So we need to make sure that that is out there. And so when you say that you're using our office to verify, you might want to either reconsider that or look at it yourself as an investigation, because we don't have the authority and we don't have the staff to do that.
Madam Secretary, for the record, Jeff Landerfelt, I'm aware of that. However, when we examine this process, there's currently, so we kind of view it as getting the best information available out there.
Right. Well, Jeff, and I appreciate what you're saying. I just want to make sure it's on the record that people aren't thinking that our office verifies and solidifies that, you know, who's on there is on there and who's involved is involved, because that's not accurate on all of these accounts. All we do is take it in and we take in the money. But I do want to say, Jeff, you know Scott Anderson, who's in the audience, and he'll be more than happy to work with the auditing division and the agency as well on that, so that either we can make changes during the legislature or we keep it as it is, but you just understand where our control is and isn't. Thank you.
Could I ask a question real quickly of the process, Madam Secretary?
General Ford.
Is there a requirement that people affirm under penalty of perjury or otherwise on the documentation that they give you that they're providing true and accurate information?
Yes.
Okay, so to the extent these folks are submitting, in my estimation, false information, and we find out about it, there is recourse that we would have relative to them not putting forth verifiable or truthful information. I want to say that out loud as well. Even though you don't have the authority or the staff or the ability to be able to verify it, they affirm themselves under penalty of perjury. Can I continue? Or are you done?
I don't know.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure that was out there and let him know that Scott's there and he's willing to work with both of them.
Okay. Along the lines of the significant influence component, I want to be certain I understand what your contention is relative to statutory changes or regulatory changes. Are you saying that, which of the two do you need to undertake in order to be able to better define?
There's a similar definition over in the gaming board laws that we're looking at presenting to the board on March 8th, or it'd be not March 19th.
Maybe I wasn't clear. Are you? Can you do that via regulation, or do you have to have a statutory change to do that?
We think because it's stated in the statute that we can do it, but again, we have to go through the whole process, so we will discover that as we go, sir.
Okay. Question about the fingerprint card process. I understand that you mail a fingerprint card to the applicants, and the applicant is supposed to return the completed card. How do you verify that the applicant's fingerprints are in fact those that are being submitted to you?
Just for the record, we don't mail them the card. The process, it's a repository process. They can go get the card and then they do that. That's up to the repository. So I agree with you. That is a concern that we have. There's a process for making sure that the people who they are, but I think people could be deceptive. I agree with you. And
Okay. Because in my office, the fingerprinting takes place in our face. I mean, we know that it's the person who's purporting to be giving us the fingerprints. So I wondered about that.
it's somewhat off topic, but if we did electronic fingerprinting, which we don't do right now, and I see a couple heads shaking here, that would maybe address it. So that's maybe as a state, we need to do that where they go in and you're at somebody and they actually do it and do that. But that's not the current process for the repository.
As regards the two applicants, well, one of them that whose license was revoked, and the other that you're going through the process with right now. With the one that was revoked, have we taken any effort to look at the past activities to ensure that there was no concern that we need to be addressing relative to public safety?
I don't want to comment on any open and criminal investigations, but I can tell you that we've worked and been compliant with DPS as they look at anything. So.
All right, thank you.
If I could ask Director Tagliati, he's got something more to add here. And we'll come back to you right after that. No, I'll come back to him after.
George Tagliati, Director, Department of Public Safety. Just a comment on the fingerprints. We have our, have our Chief of Division of Investigation, who's up in Carson City, who can get into more detail about what the process was. But regarding our records management, generally when you get your fingerprints taken, you have to go through an authorized, licensed business to do it, or a police department, or so on and so forth, and you have to show your ID and so on and so forth to match with the prints. What happened in this process in prior years, I can't really speak to that, but I would assume that our records management division would not take those and process those fingerprint cards without that authority behind it, that they were in fact the right person whose fingerprints are on the card.
That makes sense.
Dave Weiss, for the record, to agree with you, Director, you're exactly right. And we've had fingerprints that have not met the standard and have been rejected through this process. So I completely agree with that. The majority, anecdotally, the majority of people go to a law enforcement agency that I've seen to do the fingerprint. So again, I agree with you. You just know the answer better than I do.
Okay, anything else?
No, sir.
Yeah, one question.
Treasurer Conan.
Thank you. Getting back to those 122 fingerprint background checks that were requested, we've spoken a fair amount about the 2 licensees who did not comply. How about the 10%, the 12 who surrendered their license? How long were they in business before they surrendered them? What happened?
Anything that
It's probably better that we not talk about this.
yeah, I prefer not to talk about ongoing criminal investigations. Okay?
Potential ongoing.
Potential.
Investigations.
Right.
Fair enough.
Okay.
So one quick anecdotal comment. I will say that the Board of Pharmacy has been quicker in turning over the portion of their fees that ends up in the general fund. Usually we get all of that right after the fiscal year, July through September, and we've received a vast majority of it as the time goes. So I think, if nothing else, anecdotally, those practices and procedures are getting better.
Good. That's great. Do we have any questions? Does that complete the questions down here?
On that one, yeah.
Okay. Do I have any questions in Carson City on 5A?
No, Governor.
No questions?
I just have one quick question. Member
Okay.
DeLong. Along the lines of the fingerprint, I'm astounded to hear that people are still doing paper cards. Is there not a way to fingerprints and you can tell immediately if it's a good, if they get a good set or not? Working with the Gaming Control Board for years, I know they work with all the local law enforcement agencies and they're doing the fingerprints for the Gaming Control Board, again, digitally, and no money has to exchange with your agency because the people pay for it at the local law enforcement agencies. So could some thinking out of the box how to better do these fingerprints help your process and then help not having to worry about the fees and whatnot?
First of all, I appreciate that, Dave Weiss, for the record, and I agree with you. I think that's a subject for a different day. I mean, I can tell you that the board would like that. I can tell you that the repository has been excellent to work through this process. I never talked to the repository before May 3rd, and they've been excellent to work with. I think they're following the current law because I've looked at it, so I think that's something that we may need to address at a different forum. But I appreciate you saying that because, yes, if I didn't have to have the money, I wouldn't want the money, so I agree with that.
There will still be some fee involved as the repository processes and they get reimbursed for that whole. So from the initial fee to have it done, that's very different than what needs to happen from a fee perspective and resources back and forth.
Oh, submitted, got it. Okay, anything else up north?
Again, sir, I'd just like to thank you for your help and the auditors and DPS through this. You've all been invaluable for us.
Thank you, and I want to thank everyone for providing some context to this audit. I think it's extremely helpful. As many of you know, we have asked for a more thorough and comprehensive, larger review of occupational licensing boards in the interim time here, and I think that's important. And one of the goals is to streamline processes while still protecting the health and safety of all of our citizens. So that'll be preeminent. Okay, thank you for that one. Moving on to, it's an information only item, moving on to 5B. Parole and Probation, Department of Public Safety. I will, again, begin with some informal or some formal remarks, some prepared remarks, and then turn it over for the presentation, if that's okay. I am pleased to see this audit on the Division of Parole and Probation. We've made criminal justice clearly, and I apologize, for the record, I'd like to show that Lieutenant Governor has joined us, so the record can reflect that she's with us. I've made criminal justice reform a priority of my administration, and the Division of Parole and Probation plays a central and critical role in that effort. As this report notes, offender supervision is far more cost-effective to the state than simply warehousing Nevadans in jails and prisons until their debt to society is paid. Additionally, we know that efforts such as these will lead to reduction in recidivism and therefore a safer Nevada. Before we get to the report, I want to spotlight a key portion of the division's mission, which is to promote the successful reintegration of offenders back into society. The goal of the division is not to administer retribution when offenders fall short of the expectations placed on them, but to help them move past their stumbles and set them up to succeed. I want to acknowledge both the leadership and the stellar team of professionals who work day in and out to serve that mission. But we also recognize that there are always opportunities to improve our services. And this audit report is an important step to identifying some of the ways we can do so. This past legislative session, I signed AB 236 into law, which is one of the biggest steps the state has ever taken towards meaningful criminal justice reform. In addition to other meaningful measures, improving and increasing the services offered by P&P is the next step in that direction. I am confident that the stellar P&P staff, under the direction of DPS Director Tagliati, share our vision for criminal justice reform. The first step is agreeing to take this seriously, and that step is complete. They also share our understanding that implementing a 180-degree shift in the state's approach to criminal justice is a long-term process that requires intentional efforts and a lot of work. And I'm confident that they'll view the recommendations laid out as opportunities to make our state better. Thank you. So, who wants to give the report?
Good afternoon, Governor and committee members. For the record, my name is Brian Wadsworth, Executive Branch Auditor. The division is restricted on its ability to analyze data because its current database management system is old, inflexible, and labor-intensive. These restrictions limit the division's ability to identify opportunities for improvement through data analysis. The division's data limitations preclude accurate statistics needed for informing management decisions related to performance and measuring the success of its programs and services. To ensure compliance with AB 236, approved during the last legislative session, the division's ability to track offender data is imperative. Our audit objective was to improve of recidivism. 2, develop additional performance measures for programs and services. 3, adopt internal controls for offender data. And 4, allocate resources to other successful programs and services. Recidivism is a primary measure of effectiveness for programs focused. A more meaningful definition could consider all components of the population the division supervises, including data on revocations of parole or probation, absconders, and honorable versus dishonorable discharges from supervision. Each of these components have unique issues and characteristics that, if measured, could identify opportunities to reduce reincarcerations. We also recommend that the division adopt additional performance measures for programs and services. The division has 2 basic performance measures for the supervision of its offenders: percentage of successfully completed paroles and percentage of successfully completed probations, neither of which measures factors within the division's control. Data collection and analysis of more meaningful performance measures, such as effectiveness of officer interactions with offenders and collaboration with other agencies and community partners, could better inform the division on effectiveness of its efforts for successful offender reintegration into the community. Third, we recommend that the division adopt internal controls and processes to ensure data is accurate and data integrity is safeguarded. Data is only meaningful if the data entered and analyzed and reported is accurate. Safeguarding the integrity of offender data is essential to generating accurate reports for decision-making purposes. Finally, we recommend that the division allocate resources to other successful programs and services that serve the needs of those under supervision, as well as look at other reallocation alternatives. For example, bringing back in-house counseling services for offenders. We reviewed 2 current parole and probation programs, the day reporting centers and indigent funding. The day reporting centers serve as an intermediary sanction for offenders that have problems complying and is a last resort before revocation of parole or probation. Under the current contract, the day reporting centers have seen a graduation rate of about 3% and are underutilized on average by 30 participants per month. A 2-year contract in the amount of $1.9 million with a new vendor was approved at the most recent BOE meeting for the division to approve upon the services offered at the day reporting centers for participants. If, however, underutilization and performance measures under the new contract justify, resources could be shifted to a successful program. The indigent funding program has shown a positive return on investment for Nevada. The indigent funding program is used to provide up to $1,000 for temporary housing for those offenders approved for release by the Nevada Board of Parole Commissioners, but cannot be released due to a lack of financial resources to obtain housing. Without the indigent funding, offenders would remain in prison. We would like to thank the Department of Public Safety, Division of Parole and Probation, and its staff for their time and input throughout this audit, and we'd be happy to answer any questions the committee may have at this time. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. I appreciate it. I've got just a couple questions for the auditors and then a couple for the department before I move on here. Page 5 indicates that you cannot calculate a meaningful recidivism rate because of data restrictions or limitations. What are some of the data points that we're not capturing that would be helpful to flush out our actual recidivism rates?
Thank you, Governor. For the record, Warren Lohman. First and foremost, we would say that including those parolees and probationers who are under current supervision is the critical piece of data that needs to be included. In the report, we've looked at, I believe on page 8, we've listed several other items that can be included based off of the National Registry Resource Center, the Justice Center, Council of State Governments. So there are all sorts of inputs that could go into this, breaking it down to the effectiveness of officers, those that are particularly successful, those sorts of data points to help guide resourcing and programming decisions, particularly as we get into the 236 environment. And it's a very data-driven process. And we agree with the division that they are extremely limited with what they can do based on their data management system. But looking out, there's a way to improve that, and they have a plan to have something on board, I believe, in FY 2022. So those are the types of data elements we would recommend be included in that recidivism redefinition.
Okay. Then let me ask this. On page 7, you've got the chart, the parole and probation revocation rates. What are the national standards? Do we have a national guideline or comparison to go by?
I don't know.
For the record, we did not see a consistent guideline for probation. The Parole guideline is based off of what NDOC does, and they have a national standard that they follow. The chief may have more details of how neighboring states are looking in that regard.
Ann Carpenter, for the record, I don't have that information, but I can definitely look into that and get that for you.
If you would get it to all of us, that would be great. And I appreciate you brought up the contract. At a recent BOE meeting, we approved a contract to obtain non-state assistance to a private company day reporting center. What was the term and the length of that contract? It was 1.9.
Governor, that was 2 years and about 1.9 million.
Okay.
We cut it in half.
Okay, yeah.
Suggest to you and the committee that you allow us to go back into the division in a year and look at the data, see what they have, and report back to you and let that guide your judgments going forward.
That would be helpful, but if there's some specific bench points you want them to track, I mean, ahead of time, you might want to let them know so that when you do go back in, it would be helpful.
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I know one of the things that you pointed out in the audit is that underutilization is one of the occurrences taking place for the day reporting centers right now. If my memory serves correctly, at the BOE, you talked about utilizing it. So can you speak a little bit about how you're going to be able to address the underutilization that's already taken place, and how now that you have this new contract, you're actually going to be at capacity?
Absolutely. Ann Carpenter, for the record. So we just had a meeting yesterday, the day before, with a new vendor, and we've already discussed metrics. We've discussed how we will utilize it better and more efficiently. So those talks are already underway.
Okay, then I got a couple for the 3 or 4 for the division. On page 6, you identified some limitations of the offender tracking system, OTIS. Has the division identified suitable alternatives for OTIS, or are there none?
Ann Carpenter, for the record, besides hand mucking, there really isn't an alternative solution. Our people try so desperately to get the metrics that we need, and we do get those crystal reports and that sort of thing, but it's very cumbersome.
Okay, and then I mentioned the graph on page 7. Is there any explanation, do you have any background why there's such a disparity between probationers and parolees?
Sir, Ann Carpenter, for the record, I do not, but I'll look into that and see what we can find for you.
And you're gonna give me the national standards, okay? And then on page 12 and 13, the report touched on some considerations between non-rural or urban areas.
Absolutely, Ann Carpenter, for the record. So in our rural areas, there's not that many people, number one, officers and administrative staff and pre-sentence investigation writers. So the staff is limited, and so if somebody's gone, that's a problem. It's a big hit if one person's gone out of an office of 3 or 4. We have windshield time. We have a lot of people that are driving to very long distances to see one person. That could hinder us. Our pre-sentence investigation writers have to drive to different courts or to go and interview offenders that are far away, so that's an issue. Rural areas do not have the, I don't want to say amenities, but counseling services and different things that we have in the urban areas that we kind of take for granted. We don't have that out there. Housing is a huge issue. A lot of it.
Okay, I get it. Questions? Treasurer Conan, we'll start on this side.
Thank you. This is my first time in P&P, so I apologize if some of these are a little 40,000 foot view, but
When you say your first time in P&P,
it's my, just, you know,
audit?
luckily there were no fingerprints.
Okay.
You were using Otis to capture and track this information. Does the Department of Corrections also use Otis?
They have Notice, which is a different records management system, and they have access to our Otis, and we have access to their Notice, but they do not speak.
The systems don't
The
talk to each
systems
other.
do not talk, correct.
Would it be possible, at least in the window between now and 2022, to use Notice in order to get the information that Otis doesn't? And the reason, we're not collecting the data we need in order to get to the legislative intent from a criminal justice reform standpoint. Are there opportunities to use in-house systems that maybe exist down the street?
We would love that, and Carpenter, for the record, we would love that, but they don't capture the same information that we capture, so we could get different data points, but it wouldn't be helpful for that.
Could it, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, could Notice collect some of the information that needs to be captured? I mean, if it's a CRM that works?
And Carpenter, for the record, I don't know, but I can find out for you.
Okay, I think that'd be useful. And I'd also be curious, as we're looking at other states' information, whether or not the disparity the governor mentioned between probation and parole, if that also exists in other states?
I'm sorry, what was your question, sir?
The disparity between probation and parole, recidivism, revocation rates, whether or not that exists in other states. That 20% spread on page 7 of the report.
I'll have to find out for you, sir.
Okay, perfect. I appreciate
You're
it.
saying is Nevada an anomaly?
Yes.
As it relates to that?
Yeah.
Secondly, during the process of getting before 2022, are there data points that would be more effective or less effective, sort of higher level data points that we could muck through amongst the 5,000 or so people in the population every year? In other words, can we start collecting some of that information by hand so that we can get better data? Is there an incremental step there?
Is it impossible, and Carpenter, for the record, it's not impossible, but our workload and staff, we don't have the manpower to hand muck all of that information. AB 236 has provided certain metrics that we must comply with, and the Sentencing Commission we're working on that to try to figure out what we have, what we can collect, and what we cannot collect until our new records management system comes on board. So there's hope, but we're trying to take baby steps.
Okay, baby steps are certainly
And
appreciated.
just one more thing, talking to one of the professors at UNLV, it's interesting because one of the points was the effectiveness of the officer and how do we track the effectiveness of the officer, and it's not quantitative, it's qualitative, and so those are very difficult, he said, across the United States of trying to figure out how to get that information and how do we say an officer is effective versus not effective. So we're working on that too. That's part of the question.
I'd be curious in your research if you find sort of all of these qualitative things end up being quantitative conversations, because there, in a lot of cases, isn't another way to measure it. So I'm curious to see if we see what other states are doing and whether or not there's better moves there. And I think that gets into the question about how we're keeping track and whether or not we're including data from supervised individuals. It seems like the data from, again, 40,000 foot view, it seems like the data from supervised and the data from unsupervised visitor populations combined together would give you a total revocation and recidivism rate. In other words, if you're only looking at 1/2 of recidivism now, and we're not looking at that supervised population, couldn't we simply combine the two to look at a rate that would be more comparable to other states?
I think and Carpenter, for the record, I think I understand what you're saying. So the time period that they're under supervision with us, if we're not capturing that, we do capture if they're discharged or revoked. So that's at least a piece. So we have had discussions about taking that piece and taking the after they're off of supervision and looking at the totality of that and seeing what that looks like. So we'll look into that.
Yeah, I'd be very curious because I mean I think it's not going to be perfect, but it would at least get you closer to a comparable. All right, thank you, Governor.
Thank you. Secretary Sagaski.
Thank you, Governor. And this kind of goes along with some of the questioning that's been talked about, but I just wanted to make sure that I put it in my terminology so that I can hopefully get an answer. But when I look at the revolving door or hear about the revolving door and that they come out, they go back in, I look at who utilizes the DRC and how is its participation determined, who determines who gets to go in, and then are these the ones that are at the highest risk of going back? Those are just a couple questions that made me think along the lines of what the governor was talking about what we should be looking at and how do we do it? What's your methodology?
So when we first had this program, it was utilized for the highest risk people, so they would not go back to prison or go to prison for the first time. And then we realized that that population may not be the best, because sometimes people that are already your highest risk may or may not care as much. And so we had to kind of figure out maybe a medium population of people that were kind of straddling that line. We want to help them be better and give them the resources that they weren't getting. So that's part of the question. The methodology, sometimes offenders would want to volunteer and go as a last stop. Sometimes our people would look and say, hey, you keep doing this bad behavior and we want to get you some help, so we're going to give you a little bit more.
No, Governor.
Okay, I just want to emphasize, as it relates to this new day reporting center that we're contracted with, how important it is to have accurate information and make sure that we are utilizing to the full potential those services and better tracking any data points that we're concerned about, because that's why we reduced it from a 4-year contract down to 2, to decide if it's worth keeping moving forward. And I don't want to, as they say, leave any unused capacity that we could otherwise use and help some of these individuals.
Yes, sir.
Okay, anything else? Okay, I think we're good. Thank you very much. Moving on to 5C, Department of Administration, Purchasing Division, Foreign Vendors. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Governor and members of the committee. For the record, Craig Stevenson. Focused on increasing state contracts awarded to Nevada vendors. The state can do a better job helping Nevada vendors compete for state contracts. In fiscal year 2019, a 1% shift of contract awards from foreign vendors to Nevada vendors could have benefited the state by about $6.6 million. Nevada vendors are currently at a disadvantage due to the purchasing preference laws in other states. To level the playing field for Nevada vendors, we made the following recommendations. First, we recommend the division improve outreach efforts to Nevada vendors and establish a mechanism to track and measure the outreach program's effectiveness. Nevada vendor participation in the division solicitation process can be improved. In fiscal year 2019, Nevada vendors only responded to 34% of the division's bid solicitations. During the same period, foreign vendors were awarded $537 million of the division's $1.1 billion worth of contracts. The division needs to improve outreach efforts and develop a mechanism to track and measure the effectiveness of its outreach program. Outreach programs such as the Governor's Office of Economic Development and Clark County's Small Business Opportunity Program are to reinstate the inverse preference law. An inverse preference is when a state gives preference to its bidders against bidders from another state equal to the other state's preference. The inverse preference law was enacted in 2003 to help Nevada vendors. The repeal of the inverse preference law in 2009 put Nevada vendors at a disadvantage within and outside the state because of similar preferences in other states. Reinstating the inverse preference law will level the playing field and result in more contracts awarded to Nevada vendors. Third, we recommend the division establish a statewide suspended and debarred vendor list to ensure that the state is doing business with reputable vendors. 36 states and the District of Columbia have suspended and debarred vendor lists. A statewide list. We would like to thank the division for their time and input throughout the audit, and we'd be happy to answer any questions the committee may have at this time.
Thank you. I've just got a couple here. I agree wholeheartedly with the establishment of a suspended or disbarred vendor list. Otherwise, there's no consequence, so to speak. And I know it's something that we look at the county in terms of contractors, whether it should be attached to the company or be attached to the individuals who own the company, because there's other folks here as well, and they could just form a new LLC. So I think it's something that's extremely important that we do, that we establish moving forward. So whatever we can do in that regard would be helpful. And then the 5% preference list, that's something that, boy, it's concerning that over half of our contracts are going to out-of-state. So maybe it's outreach to the various chambers and business groups or something, but we're losing a lot of business that way, and that's really unfortunate. I don't know if anybody else has any ideas.
Well, I have a question about why we repealed. I just don't. I remember when I was in the legislature talking about inverse preference stuff, but I don't remember what happened. I think you made
Special preference or?
Yeah, the inverse preference. So
bid?
when it was
Yeah,
repealed,
for
I
local
wasn't there.
businesses.
But any idea why it was repealed in the first instance? Anybody?
I can't remember. I'm sure we can find out from somebody, but
Hi, good
I
afternoon.
do have a comment for you.
I'm sorry, you said he has.
Yep.
Good afternoon, Governor, members of the committee. I am Kevin Doty, Administrator for State Purchasing. I have read the legislative history from when the inverse preference, a preference for a business owned by a disabled veteran. And there was some discussion in the legislative history regarding stacking of preferences and how they didn't want preferences stacked. I don't think that's really an issue with an inverse preference, but it was either that was the reason why the inverse preference was removed, or perhaps a clever lobbyist just took advantage of the opportunity to kill the inverse preference. There's no way of knowing from the legislative history.
But I think it's important for us to take a look at that. I can imagine certain arguments being raised from other states on this type of thing, but that's why I wondered if that was in the history. But we'll take a look at that in our office.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, with we're losing over half. I mean, that's just, even with the preference.
The vendors, Governor, if I might, without saying too much, we have an issue with vendors being qualified to do their jobs. They come in and tell the legislature and tell us that they can do a certain act and that they can follow through, they can have these dates and they get all of this, and then you had an agency that had the same issue, and then they don't follow through. Mm-hmm. And then what recourse do we have other than staying with that group and to utilize them? And I do believe that I'd rather have somebody in state to yell at than somebody out of state over the phone. Who's laughing? Anyway, just kidding. Well, I'm really not. But that is a big issue for us in the state of Nevada, is trying to find a vendor that is qualified and that can do the job. We get lots of bids, and the lowest bid is not always the best bid, and it's not always the best person. So that is an issue and has always been an issue with us. But I don't know why the law was changed. That didn't make any sense to me at all, what you just said, sir. So that's typical. Yeah. But we need to have homegrown. We need to have people here, but we don't have that. And that's why we go out to other states and other entities to get people that say, yeah, I can do that. I know exactly what you're talking about, and they don't fulfill it. So we need some help as far as the vendors go in what we can do and where we're going to go with
No,
this.
you're right. It's particularly true in the IT field. I mean,
it's
I've argued this since I was on the Board of Regents. So why are we producing these people that fill these functions?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Treasurer Conan.
Two things. I think a comment on the inverse side. There may have been a reason to get rid of it when fewer states had it, but now that 34 states have it, it's a bit of an arms race. We are going to be at a disadvantage until we put something like that back in. When it comes to vendors, something that we've found has been useful is, as we go through either with RFPs or informal solicitations, we're doing searches, at least in the Treasury, to find vendors within the state who do that work. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of times, regardless of the outreach that your office does, regardless of the outreach that GoEd does, some of these companies are just not paying attention to public announcements of places they can do business. But if you find them, told them that there's going to be an RFP out there, they will apply. So I'm wondering if perhaps there's an opportunity to suggest that state agencies take that affirmative step, look for these vendors in state, and then if they say, look, there is no vendor in state that meets the qualifications, either because they didn't submit to the RFP or did submit and then didn't meet the qualifications, then you can pick somebody from out of state. But I think adding that additional step, putting on the division or the department or the office who's looking for it could be helpful. I'm sure in purchasing, sometimes they're seeing RFPs for projects they've never seen before, so they might not have a vendor. Yeah.
Governor, this is Kate Marshall, Lieutenant Governor. I just wanted to ask the auditors whether or not you had an opportunity to focus on whether small businesses can be vendors for the state. And I wanted to give you an example. Last legislative session, a bill was passed to say that if you were going to be a company that did business with the state, that you had to have you had to train your employees in sexual discrimination. I know other states that have create an entire training program, could download the video and train their employees that way, and then still have the opportunity to do business with the state. And I know my office has heard from many small businesses, especially businesses in rural areas, that they will no longer be able to compete because there is no tool for them to do these kinds of things that larger companies can do. And I wondered if you looked at the impact on small businesses and whether or not there are things that the state could do to facilitate small businesses being able to do business with the state.
Kevin Doty for the record. I guess some of the good news about these numbers is that these only reflect the solicitations led by state purchasing. We only do high dollar amount solicitations, so we do RFPs for $100,000 or more. The agency-led solicitations, which those numbers aren't reflected in this report, because those numbers we really can't get our hands on. I'm hopeful that more small businesses are getting a larger share of the smaller dollar work. And we have a short form contract for amounts less than $50,000 that hopefully reduces some of the paperwork burden on small businesses. But other than that, I don't know if there's much we can do legally as far as how we award contracts to small businesses. But anything we can do outreach-wise to help small businesses, help them with the registering as a vendor process, help them with the teaching them how to write a good proposal in response to an RFP, help them with, because our contracts all have insurance requirements, help them with that portion of it, let them know what they need to do and things like that. Our vendor outreach person has done a good job working with small businesses when we do interact with them. He actually went and sat at the home of a hay farmer to help that hay farmer log into our system and place a bid so that we could buy hay for Prison Industries Ranch. But shockingly, a few years ago, we were actually buying hay from a California farm. And that was an example of something that was just ridiculous, and so we made an effort to make an outreach and get Nevada hay farmers signed up and part of our program. But anytime you hear about small businesses that want to be part of doing business with the state of Nevada, please contact me and let me know. We're always trying to get as many Nevada businesses signed up as possible.
I really appreciate it, and I appreciate the outreach. I think, for example, I was not talking about contracts under $100,000. I was talking about $1 million contracts for paving and construction and these kinds of things that we do in Nevada, that there are companies that can do that, but they may not have the personnel to then add a whole training division or these kind of things. And like I was saying, what I've seen other states do is literally put these kinds of programs on their website so that small businesses can participate. So I just wondered if you might take that back and think about that. Videos and training manuals where small businesses need to be able to, like you say, check certain boxes. And I really appreciate what you did with hay farming. Thank you. That's all, Governor. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions up north? No?
No, Governor.
5C. Okay. 6A, presentation of special follow-up status report. Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Public and Behavioral Health.
Good afternoon, Governor, members of the committee. For the record, Ashwini Prasad. Representing the Division of Public and Behavioral Health is Administrator Lisa Sherrick, and in Las Vegas, Deputy Administrator Joanne Mollet. This is our 12th report on doctor attendance at Ross and Newell Hospital. Our review shows the division can account for doctor work hours, although a large number of hours for some doctors are performed off-site away from the hospital. To account for doctor work hours, the hospital utilizes the gap analysis report, which reconciles doctor absences from the hospital with To account for doctor work hours, the hospital utilizes the gap analysis report, which reconciles doctor absences from the hospital with authorized and documented meetings, trainings, and other events. In August 2017, the division also implemented an additional report which reconciles approved off-site hours with recorded electronic medical record entries. In October 2019, the division created policies and procedures for how doctors are approved for off-site work hours and for what purposes. During the most recent review period of fiscal year 2019, we found overall, on average, hospital doctors are working 33% of their compensated hours away from the hospital. We also noted select doctors were working from 17 to 66% of their compensated time off-site from the hospital. We found use of off-site hours by doctors approved for off-site work was 2% higher for the Rapid Stabilization Unit and 4% higher for the during the fiscal year 2019 review period. The result is the average number of hours doctors approved for off-site work hours are on-site for patient care in the hospital for 4 hours and 16 minutes during a 10-hour day. We also found in many weeks there were more hours accounted for on division reports and claimed on timesheets by contract doctors who worked off-site. Neither the affected doctors nor the division attempted to adjust compensation based on the variance between the reports and timesheets. To note, 4 contract doctors were consistently compensated for 50 or more work hours in a week during the review period. These doctors also recorded the most approved off-site hours. The division should continue monitoring efforts to ensure doctors work a full day, timesheets are accurate, and off-site hours are reviewed and approved. This concludes my overview of the Ross and Newell Hospital doctor attendance special follow-up. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Okay, I've got a couple. And this is an issue that I faced many years ago when I was in the Board of Regents, and faculty members were going off-site and testifying, in fact, and they use the prestige of the university and their faculty status to earn that. What assurance do we have that they're doing work for the hospital and not on the side kind of work?
Governor, we would refer that to the agency as they
Okay.
are the on-the-ground folks there with.
Okay.
Okay. For the record, Joe Millay, Deputy Administrator for the Division of Public and Behavioral Health. And so what we do to ensure that the off-site hours are indeed related to the work for the hospital is we do have a couple of things. We have service codes that they have to provide in our electronic health record that says exactly what they were doing during that time. We also look at their key card activity in the hospital and outside when they're not there, so that it corresponds. If they weren't on site, were they actually at a particular meeting? So we can also go back on our records and see if the meeting was held at that time. So we double track that as well. If they were doing residential supervision, things like that, and the time amount they actually entered their documentation into the electronic health record.
Okay, have we found any discrepancies?
When we do find discrepancies in that, and sometimes the hours or minutes don't quite add up, it's the medical staff office that goes back and has the providers, in this case psychiatry, reconcile those
So we have found discrepancies, but then they're accounted for? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, there has been some where they say, well, that meeting went longer than they had, or their documentation wasn't quite adding up to where their hours were. And then they give us some explanation for that usually. And then
what about travel time? I mean, which can be significant in this town anymore.
It can be, but we don't provide for travel time.
So they're not compensated for the travel time?
No,
The ones that are claiming 50 hours plus per week, they're not?
that's correct.
Okay, and what happens to the coverage at the hospital if these 3 doctors are supposed to be there and 2 of them are out in the field? What coverage is left at the hospital?
We always have a psychiatrist that is on call and available at all times. And we also have a medical provider who's actually there 24/7.
Okay. Anybody else? Secretary Sagaski?
Thank you, Governor. My questions might be a little off of topic, but it's one that's relevant to me because I live just like a mile from the hospital. You had quite a few years back a problem with the security gate going down after the ambulance brought in a patient. Has that been rectified totally? Because, I mean, that was a big issue, and one of the patients got out, ran across the street to an office building and went inside. So I'm just curious if that's been rectified.
Yes, so Joe Millay for the record. So yes, the gate, we have regular maintenance on it, but also we have staff there as soon as the ambulance is outside the bay in order to escort the patient.
Okay, so the door works and it comes down and they can't get out. Okay, thank you.
It actually opens outward and inward.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else?
Nope, that's it.
General Ford? Any questions up north? Any?
No, thank you.
Okay.
Governor, if I may, this is listed on the agenda as an action item for.
Right. This is an action item. Do I have a motion on item number 6A?
What's the
Well,
emotion?
the question would be, since this was a special review, would the committee like us to continue with this special review annually and report back on what we found?
Would the maker of the motion consider?
So move.
Second.
The motion is to accept it and to continue it on an annual basis. Passes. Item number 7, revision of the annual audit plan pursuant to NRS 3538.038.
Thank you, Governor. For the record, Warren Lohman. We've not brought any new audits to you to request approval. This is the layout going forward unless any committee members would like anything changed. We will continue as planned with note that under the current approval to audit parole and probation, we will do a follow-up of the DRCs in a year.
Right. Do we have any comments on the plan? Do I have a motion to adopt the plan as approved?
So moved.
We have a motion on the floor to adopt the plan. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing and seeing none. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Item number 8 is committee member comments. Do any committee members have a comment? Secretary Sagaski.
Thank you. I had the privilege Friday night of going to a concert where they had a pianist, a celloist, and a violinist. And I was told that this group goes into prisons all over the United States, actually the world, but they are not ask and find out. But they go in, they play music. They've gotten some really good responses and some, so I don't know, for whatever reason, I don't know, but I would love to find out if we can have music put into the prisons. I'd like to look at that.
Appreciate that. I will find that out after we leave here.
Okay.
I don't know if you know anything about that. Anybody? No. Aaron, are you familiar with that? We've got a question, Kyle, about if there is music allowed in the prisons. Secretary Sagaski had a performance group of young folks that go to prisons across the country, but for some reason they aren't allowed in Nevada prison. And if we could find out why. We could look into that.
Thank you.
Certainly.
Thanks.
Any questions up north? No?
Let me offer a compliment. I, like you, everybody else around here travels around the country, I'm sure, quite frequently, and we talk to our colleagues here and there. And a lot of people talk about criminal justice reform. They talk about what they want their state to do and what they want to represent. But the way today you laid out and talking about PNP and things of that sort, your impression and your intention to capitalize on criminal justice reform, and I think should be noted out loud. A lot of folks say it, they don't really mean it, they use it as a talking point, but you talking directly to your agency, let them know what you expect to see, I think should not go without notice.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I want to compliment the audit staff. I've worked with audit staffs at the higher education system and at the county, and sometimes auditors tend to play gotcha, you know, when they're going in for audits and find little stuff. And it's my experience that you don't do that here, that these are constructive, educational audits that.
The audit division did a lot of our audits for us. The previous governor asked any of the agencies if they wanted an audit, and we said yes. I mean, we welcomed it to see how we could improve. And I have to tell you, this crew has been nothing but absolutely fantastic to give us recommendations, working with everybody. I can't say enough about them, except that they stole Jeff from me. He used to work in the Secretary of State's office, so just saying.
Ward's smiling when he says that. We did. He's year to year, he's grinning.
But I just can't say enough either. I'm with you. I think they do a wonderful job, and they're very helpful.
Yep.
Extremely helpful.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to item number 9, public comment. Anyone wishing to address the board on any item, please step forward, identify yourself for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes. Do we have anybody push that little white thing? There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon, Governor Sisolak and members of the committee. My name is Sarah Hunt, and I'm the Assistant Dean of Behavioral Health Sciences for the School of Medicine at UNLV. One of the things that I do at UNLV is work on mental health workforce development. So as we're aware, the majority of our citizens reside in a mental health professional workforce development shortage area. So my comments relate to the occupational and licensing board policy that was discussed today. And I'm here to present just a little bit of a history lesson. So back in fall of 2016, there was an initiative and there was a proposal to consolidate or transfer those boards to the Board of Health. We had a summit at the same time at UNLV that fall and about mental health workforce development. We invited representatives of those boards to come and talk about that proposal. So to kind of talk about the pros and cons of what that might look like in restructuring their boards or how their boards might function differently. And those board members all came up with pros and cons for what that could look like. However, I thought there were a couple of strong lessons that came out of their comments. One was they didn't feel like they were engaged early in the conversation about that, and that there could have been better communication about what the specifics were for that proposal. So I'm just here to present that as kind of feedback from the history of attempts prior, that their early engagement and clear communication was one thing that was requested or highlighted. And to me, this is just an area of concern as I think about all of the graduates that leave our NSHE institutions, especially if they studied mental health. I want them to stay in Nevada, and I want the licensing process to be very clear and easy for them. So I'm following this conversation closely. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If I might, ma'am, thank you very much for that. Brings me up to a bill was presented at the legislature that was heavily defeated, I believe, because they did not agree upon it. And I think it was the marriage and family therapists that were the most opposed to them all being brought together.
Again, Sarah Hunt for the record. There probably would have been feedback from all of those 4 boards.
Okay, all right, because we got a lot of it. We got a lot of phone calls and emails, and I remember that legislation coming before us, so.
Yes, and it looked completely different than when it hit the session, and as we know, the 4 boards are still working independently. But they've made a lot of progress in cleaning up the process to get licensed easily in Nevada, so I'm glad to see that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in Las Vegas wishing to speak during public comment? Seeing no one, do we have anyone in Carson City wishing to speak during public comment?
No, Governor.
Okay, do we have a motion for adjournment? We have a motion to adjourn. Any discussion on that motion? Hearing, seeing none. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.